Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and today I'd like to talk about Psi Development Systems. Well, Psi Development Systems is the name of my second book. You can see the book cover there in the paperback edition. It went through two editions. The first was a hardbound, published in 1981, I believe it was, and the second was the paperback that came out in 1987. Well, this book is actually based on my doctoral dissertation at Berkeley. Some people have mistakenly thought that The Roots of Consciousness was my doctoral dissertation, but in effect, The Roots of Consciousness, the most popular book I've written, was published as the equivalent of a qualifying exam, or to let my faculty committee at Berkeley, when I was a doctoral student in parapsychology, know that I was prepared to take a qualifying exam. In other words, that I had a real strong understanding of the background and overview of the field of parapsychology and related areas. And then my passion was to explore the field of psychic training. How do you take the average person and develop their psychic abilities? And so Psi Development Systems was also the name of my doctoral dissertation. And in it, I looked at historical approaches, including shamanism, yoga, many different approaches that were part of spiritual traditions, essentially. And I looked at contemporary popular approaches, things like Silva mind control, and a couple of dozen different training programs that were offered through institutes like the Berkeley Psychic Institute, or various individuals who had psychic talents had their own training programs, and I surveyed those. And then I looked at the experimental literature of parapsychology to see what it also contributed. So when you combine these, the historical approaches, the contemporary popular approaches, the experimental approaches, there were dozens of approaches to training psychic abilities that I examined. And I attempted to break them down to see what were they doing, what was the method, what was their secret, so to speak. Unfortunately, there wasn't any really good data to show that any of them had actual success because, well, for one thing, most of them never endeavored to measure that. A few of them did, and the results weren't particularly promising. And then what I also did in the summer of 1977 is I conducted my own program in training remote viewing abilities. And I'd had quite a bit of success in remote viewing training up until that time. But here's the intriguing thing. What I discovered was that it's easy to have success if you do a short program, like a weekend program training remote viewing, because I guess you could call it beginner's luck, or simply the ability of a naive person to do remote viewing. It's not that hard at all. And people who are well-adjusted, successful adults typically do quite well on the first trial. And one of those programs I ran some time ago, we had a reporter from one of the newspapers in Chicago. I was doing a weekend program with my wife, Janelle, training remote viewing, and this reporter showed up and went through the program and had a direct hit on a complex target. We were in a cemetery at the time, as I recall, and wrote a big story up about it, a big spread in the one of the Sunday news magazines in Chicago. But what I found was, essentially, back in 1977, it was a bit ahead of the times, especially because after I graduated with my doctoral degree in parapsychology, I was libeled and felt mortified and was not willing to really put myself out there into the public space when I knew anybody could go and say, look, here's this magazine article, it says you're incompetent, and how am I to deal with that? Until I won the libel suit, eventually, or at least it was settled favorably in my behalf. Then I began rebuilding my reputation and rebuilding my life. And it was actually at that time that I started the Thinking Aloud television series. But now, can you imagine, some 40 years later, I'm beginning to take another look at my work in Psi Development. And one of the things I realized, looking at all of these systems, what did they have in common? What was one of the most important features? And I'll tell you, I think it is a social environment providing positive feedback and support for people. Now, what I did in the summer of 1977 was run an 8-week training program where we tested people once a week for 8 weeks on remote viewing skills, and we spent every day together for 8 weeks. So it was very intense, 4 or 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks. But at the end of the day, given that the empirical measurement was a remote viewing test, what I found was that people scored quite well the very first week. And then what happened is, as the consequences of doing well in remote viewing began to sink in, there were a lot of emotions that came up for people and difficulty in accepting this as an integral part of their life, and the scores declined. And then over time, I would say the scores dropped for about the first 3-4 weeks, and then they began to slowly build back up. So at the end of the 8th week, people were doing about as well as they had in the first week. But the only way to make sense of that data was to evaluate it through what was known in the statistical literature as a J-curve, that the scores start high, drop low, and then move back up again. And as a consequence of that, it's occurred to me that what's really required, if we want to have a society where people can cultivate their various psychic capacities the same way people are encouraged to develop their mathematical abilities, their athletic abilities, their speaking abilities, acting, music, art abilities, all of these things are widely supported in the culture, but psychic abilities are not. And what I'd like to create, what I'm thinking about creating, is a special vehicle for people who wish to be part of a community where there's support and encouragement for becoming more psychic. Now, I know in a way the whole new Thinking Aloud video series does exactly that. I've uploaded over 600 individual videos supporting the reality of psychic functioning and related functioning in many, many different ways. But I'm now thinking of doing something a bit more, something that would involve mentoring and coaching. I don't know exactly the form it will take, but I have created a little questionnaire now that I'm linking. You'll see a link in the upper right of your screen so that those of you who are viewing this InPresence segment could answer a couple of questions to help me consider whether to take this possibility to another level, to revive the work I began over 40 years ago with Psi Development Systems. And I'm kind of thinking along the lines of Dr. Xavier of the X-Men and his Institute for Higher Learning, because it occurs to me that not everybody is interested in remote viewing. It's a great model for psychic training. It involves clairvoyance. It's being pursued by some interesting groups for financial forecasting in particular. But Dr. Xavier's model from the Marvel comic book series talks about working with many different people who have many different diverse talents, each one unique, each one special. Like, for example, my friend Janice, whom I referred to a few days ago in an InPresence monologue, was great at finding four-leaf clovers, but not so good at remote viewing. So this is a thought of mine. I am thinking of taking this to a new level, and I would very much appreciate for those of you who have an interest in taking your own development to a new level to get some feedback from you. So I hope you'll seriously look at the little questionnaire. If you do, you'll be able to see the answers provided by other viewers, and I will review the comments seriously, and it may well be that in the coming weeks and months, I will unfold some new possibilities in addition to everything else you can find on the New Thinking Aloud channel for people who would like to participate at a deeper level yet with regard to Psi development. Thank you for giving this your consideration, and thank you for being with me.